Post-World War II environmental hazards in the Philippines. The nuclear legacy of the United States military at Clark Air Base and SUBIC Naval Facility.
The chemicals and hazardous materials from former U.S. military bases in the Philippines are the responsibility of the United States government. Full compensation for the chemical problems should be paid to the Philippines.
The Philippines is a country in Southeast Asia composed of 7,000 islands. It is located 500 miles off the coast of mainland Southeast Asia. The Philippines has a tropical climate and 90% of the land receives 70 inches of rain annually.
It's got me by my soul to squeeze. Well, all the love from me. With all the dying trees.
Manila, the capital of the Philippines, has a population of over 1.8 million. The Filipino people speak Tagalog and 82% of the population is Roman Catholic. The rest of the population is 9% Protestant, 5% Muslim, and 3% Buddhist. Ethnically, most of the people are Malays, Chinese, Muslims, or mestizos.
The first inhabitants of the Philippines arrived up to 300,000 years ago. They were followed by the Negrito 25,000 years ago. Muslims arrived in 1380 and established an Islamic empire.
The Spanish-American War was started partially because the Spanish had forced some Cubans into concentration camps and the U.S. objected. Another reason for the war was that the United States had a lot of industrial ties with Cuba, so the Spanish were causing an economic problem for the U.S. The Spanish soldiers had been exhausted by years of fighting, so they gave up quickly and the war only lasted 4 months.
There was a decorated general with a heart of gold that likened him to all the.
When the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, the Philippines made a Declaration of Independence on June 12th. The Philippines was made a colony of the United States against its will, making it the first and only colony of the United States. In 1902, Filipino troops against the U.S. occupation of the Philippines united, and the Philippine-American War resulted.
And walked slowly out of his tent. All the men held tall with their chests in the air, with the courage and the blood and a fire in their.
United States military troops fought the Filipinos, who wanted the Philippines to be a free country. During the war, the U.S. seized land in Tarlac and Pampanga that was later used to build Clark Air Force Base. In 1904, SUBIC Navel Facility was built in Olongapo. Clark Air Force Base and SUBIC Naval Facility were later used by the U.S. military for operations in many countries around the world.
An agreement was signed in 1947 that allowed the U.S. military to keep 23 bases in operation for 99 years. This agreement was signed even though the United States granted the Philippines with independence in 1946. During the 45 years that followed, the U.S. bases in the Philippines were used for operations against China, Siberia, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Middle East, and the Persian Gulf.
In 1991, Mount Pinatubo, a 4,872-foot volcano in Luzon near Clark Air Base erupted, making the airbase unusable. Due to damages from the eruption, Clark Air Base was shut down. A treaty to allow the U.S. military to continue operations in the Philippines was rejected by the Philippine Senate in 1992. This resulted in the U.S. abandoning all military bases in the Philippines.
As people became aware of the toxic waste and hazardous materials resulting from the U.S. military bases, people began to organize to solve the problem. When the U.S. military left the bases, the Philippines was left with the burden of waste and hazardous materials that were products of the military operations.
The wastes of the U.S. were not cleaned up or contained, so the impact of the government's carelessness extends to the areas surrounding the bases. Many of these areas contain communities of Filipinos with no defense against the waste. The hazardous chemicals from former U.S. military bases in the Philippines are detrimental to the health of the Filipino people. When people drink the water from the wells, they consume all of the chemicals present in the groundwater with potentially lethal effects.
According to the U.S. General Accounting Office, toxic waste contamination left on SUBIC Naval Facility and Clark Air Base is of Superfund proportions. Superfund refers to the most toxic contaminated sites being cleaned up in the United States. A Pentagon official called SUBIC a toxic horror story. These are the 3 most toxic locations containing waste from SUBIC Naval Base. The hazardous materials left behind on the former U.S. military bases include unexploded bombs.
Unexploded ordnance can contaminate groundwater and can release various types of chemicals that would be detrimental to human health.
Soil samples taken from near Clark Air Base and SUBIC Naval Facility were found to contain PCBs, JP4 jet fuel, petroleum hydrocarbons, and asbestos. Groundwater was found to contain mercury, lead, benzene, and toluene. The levels of contaminants found in the water were above the drinking water standards. These toxins cause birth defects, cancer, liver and kidney damage, nervous system disorders, developmental disorders, anemia, and leukemia.
These statistics were taken from residents living on or near Clark Air Force Base and SUBIC Naval Facility. Many of these problems could be avoided by drinking bottled water instead of groundwater from the wells. FACES is the Filipino-American Coalition for Environmental Solutions. One of its members is Amy Suzara.
It is hard to buy bottled water. And what happened during that time when it was most acute, I guess, in the early 90s, there was some people were able to buy bottled water, and there was some provided, but it was really hard for them to transport the water, and it was hard for them to get access to clean water, basically. For the past decade or so, there's been a lot of grassroots mobilization, both in the Philippines and here, and in partnership with the communities. And some of the actions that have happened are health studies have been done by, for example, by Rosalie Bertel, who's a Canadian scientist, and scientists going over there from the U.S. Compiling information. But then again, these are NGOs using whatever resources they have, and the communities have started mobilize themselves. And in the past, most recently, petitions have been gathered, and there was a petition by the communities themselves that was submitted to the Department of Defense.
Many organizations formed and sued the United States to get the U.S. government to clean up the hazardous materials left on the former U.S. military bases.
The U.S. government has basically claimed that they have no responsibility towards the communities near the base. So they're not responsible for any cleanup. They hold to kind of the legal stance that there's no responsibility. And basically demanding or asking for a preliminary assessment and site inspection. And then following that was a lawsuit that was filed by the communities, FACES, organization I'm a part of, and Archie College.